Resuming debate, reprise au débat, the honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Another year, another budget, another set of broken promises rolled up into Bill C-44, the Budget Implementation Act. There is, I suppose, a certain irony that this government, which claims to be opposed to omnibus bills, would bring in this massive document that touches on so many areas, rather than separate legislation for their new ventures, such as the infrastructure bank. The government hopes that by burying the legislation in these hundreds of pages, that they can avoid any detailed scrutiny. You do have to give the Liberals credit for one thing. One thing, Madam Speaker, they are treating Canadians equally and raising everyone's taxes. That is not surprising when you consider the reckless spending by this government. In 2015 election, they made a promise to Canadians. They would run a small or modest deficit, perhaps about $10 billion a year, and a first-year term, and then we know that after that they should be able to balance the budget after their first term. We know now that those were empty promises. I leave it to Canadian people to decide if they were lies or just incompetence. Once again, the Finance Minister has let Canadians down. There is nothing small or modest about this deficit that he's running. He has no plan to balance the budget by the end of this Parliament, or maybe ever again. The previous Conservative budget suggested balanced budget legislation that would include pay cuts for cabinet ministers while the government was running a deficit. Somehow, I don't think we are going to see this government take that sort of principled stand. Anyone who has ever run a business knows that borrowed money has to be repaid. The Minister of Finance is sinking Canada further into debt, making future generations pay for his spending spree. It is wrong to mortgage Canada's future this way. Politicians should be setting an example and not behaving as if money grows on trees. The government will tell you that it's doing great things with the spending spree. Look at us, they say. Aren't we great? We know how to spend money, of course. That's quite pride that this government has shown people so far. Any child can delight in spending money that does not belong to them, because fiscal responsibility, Madam Speaker, is a lot tougher to accomplish, and this government doesn't seem to want to work hard enough to do so. And what are the great things this government is doing? Tax increases for 1.8 million Canadians, public transit users, or those who drink beer and wine, or those who donate medicines to worthy causes. More tax hikes on child care, on small business owners such as farmers, fishers, doctors, lawyers and accountants, on oil and gas companies, and on tourism. The Liberal motto seems to be, if it breathes, tax it. Where spending is needed, they instead cut back. We are looking at major cuts to defense spending, despite demands from the US and other NATO members. Spend at least 2% of GDP to shoulder a greater amount of load for our collective security. This government is deferring $8.5 billion in equipment purchases for our military, having already deferred $3.7 billion in the past budget. Our armed forces may be the best trained and bravest fighting force in the world, but the men and women on the front lines cannot do their job without proper equipment. National defense is clearly not a priority for this government, for this Liberal government. In an era of reckless Liberal spending, it is appalling that the largest cuts are consistently at the expense of Canadian armed forces. This raises the question of whether or not the Liberals believe that Canada needs the ability to defend itself and our allies. Recent examples, including the Liberals' decision to pull out our CF-18s out of the fight against ISIS, their preference for fourth-generation fighter jets, their lack of increased support for our Ukrainian allies, and their failure to advance important procurement projects suggests that the Liberals expect other countries to do Canada's share. Canada is back. We heard that a lot. Canada is back, they said. But only as long as you don't ask us to do anything, expect look pretty. The Liberals have repeatedly delayed releasing their defense policy review. Instead of ensuring that our men and women in uniform have the best equipment, training, and support available, it's looking more and more likely that Canada's military will be further scaled back and asked to do more with less. Madam Speaker, since the Liberals took office, 94% of announced infrastructure projects have failed to start construction. Just big talk, no walk. This means that jobs are not being created and the economy is not being stimulated. Instead of coming up with a new plan that actually builds infrastructure and creates jobs, now the government wants to double down on the existing infrastructure plan that have been proven not to work. This is how the Liberals define innovation. We already knew that the Liberals were planning to take billions of dollars away from communities to pay for their infrastructure bank. Now we learn that they're also going to cancel the public transit tax credit, making it more expensive for Canadians to use public transit. So speaking of doing something, talking something and doing something else. Additionally, by allocating public transit funding based on ridership, the Liberal government is disadvantaging Canada's growing communities in favor of already developed urban cities or centres. It looks like no new public transit spending will occur in 2017-2018. Indeed, the Liberals have decreased the federal share of funding for public transit projects to 40% and failed to include provincial cost-sharing requirements. Without matching funding, municipalities may not be able to complete important projects. It is a mistake for the Liberals to continue to allocate public transit funds based primarily on ridership numbers. This formula favors large urban centres that already has developed public transit systems and disadvantages growing communities that arguably need these funds more. Municipalities need good infrastructure, but they also need programs that are easy to access, provide predictable funding, and do not leave small and rural communities behind. They also need money now, not at some point in the far future, probably in 2050 or in the 22nd century. We know that $1 billion of LAPS infrastructure funding from 2016 will not be reallocate until 2022-2023. And that $15 billion will be taken away from community infrastructure projects in order to finance the Liberals' new infrastructure bank, including $5 billion removed from public transit projects, $5 billion removed from trade and transportation corridor projects, and another $5 billion removed from green infrastructure projects. So taking money that costs less to borrow money that's going to cost maybe twice or three times more. Madam Speaker, Bill C-44 includes that Canada Infrastructure Bank Act, but it's hazy on some details. Will foreign investors get to decide which infrastructure project is funded? We already know that it will not be operating at arm's length, making it susceptible to the Liberal government interference in its decisions. Madam Speaker, one last thing I would like to look at is the changes that this bill makes to the operation of the Parliamentary Budget Officer. It is important to note that the government did not consult the PPO on these changes, but has introduced them unilaterally. The PPO has expressed concerns about this legislation and its impacts on the ability to do his job. He feels it will undermine the independence and non-partisanship of the PPO and undercut his office's ability to support Parliament. This should be a concern for all parliamentarians, regardless of their political affiliation. This Act makes changes to the degree of control that the Speakers of the Senate and the House of Commons will be expected to exercise over the office of the PPO's activities, and it places limits on the PPO ability to initiate, report, and members' ability to request cost estimates of certain proposals. To involve the PPO in the cost of election platforms, as this act does, seems to me to risk the nonpartisan nature of the office